Kraven the Hunter didn't just flop, it might have killed an entire franchise. Wondering what went so very wrong? Time for a post-mortem following the film's disastrous debut. Well before Kraven the Hunter ever hit theaters, people knew that the movie wasn't going to be a box office smash. Madam Web and Venom: The Last Dance didn't fare particularly well at the box office, and nobody expected Kraven to outperform them.
Who's next?
Ahead of its debut, some projections estimated that Kraven would earn somewhere between $20 and $25 million during its opening weekend. That's not a lot of money for a big-budget superhero flick, and even the people behind the movie seemed to acknowledge that things weren't looking good. Kraven the Hunter director J.C. Chandor acknowledged that the other Sony Spider-Man universe movies had given the concept a bad reputation that might damage the performance of his movie. He said, "People have got to give us a chance and come out and support this film, and literally try to wash away some of the other stuff that's happened. Give our film a chance." Despite Chandor's plea, it seems pretty obvious that the reception of movies like Morbius and Madam Web had an effect on Kraven's bottom line. No one expected Kraven the Hunter to set a new high-water mark for the Sony Spider-Man universe. However, there was some hope that it could at least outperform Madam Web's roughly $15 million in its opening weekend. The lowest projections for Kraven put the movie's opening at just $13 million, but some more optimistic takes guessed the movie might bring in upwards of $20 million. Ultimately, Kraven beat all the predictions in the worst way possible. The movie earned just $11 million at the domestic box office in its opening weekend. In addition to doing worse than Madam Web, it earned significantly less than Sony's other two worst performers. Even Morbius earned $39 million, and Venom: The Last Dance's $51 million is downright respectable by comparison. Globally, Kraven didn't do any better, earning just $15 million despite opening in over 20,000 theaters. Kraven couldn't have gotten off to a more disappointing start, and unfortunately there's not much reason to suspect that the movie will turn things around going forward. It experienced a whopping 66% drop at the box office in its first Monday, which just goes to show that word of mouth isn't likely to keep the movie on life support for very long. While Kraven the Hunter's performance at the box office was bad by any metric, the problems were compounded because the movie cost so much money to make. And while the pricey visual effects usually make superhero movies expensive, Kraven might not have needed the hundreds of millions of dollars it cost Marvel to make a movie like Avengers Endgame. Additionally, Kraven took a long time to develop. It was initially conceived in 2018, but filming didn't begin until all the way in 2022. At that point, it cost $90 million to make, but reshoots for the movie were complicated by the 2023 writer's strike, causing the budget to balloon up to $110 million. Even at $90 million, the budget for Kraven would be a massive problem considering how little the movie made during its opening weekend. However, it's especially bad that the movie's $11 million box office take covered just half of the increased production costs. If the Sony Spider-Man universe were to continue after Kraven, it would have to find a whole new source of funds, since the movie isn't likely to make anything near a profit.
You don't get to do that to me anymore.
It's easy enough to argue that Kraven the Hunter failed on its own merits, but it's worth noting that the movie didn't have favorable conditions going into its opening weekend. While Kraven wasn't up against many new movies, it did need to compete against two box office giants. Moana 2 took the weekend's top spot by earning over $26 million, and Wicked continued to blow everyone away by raking in over $22 million, despite having been in theaters for nearly a month. On the new movie front, Kraven did have to contend with the release of The Lord of the Rings: The War of Rohirrim. That animated movie took 5th place at the weekend box office, earning just over $4.5 million, but it potentially siphoned off some would-be Kraven viewers.
You will pay for this!
With its R rating, Kraven was targeting a slightly different audience than all those films, but even there it had to compete with Gladiator 2. Sony's movie ultimately earned more money over the weekend, but Gladiator 2 raked in well over $7 million despite being in its third week. The bottom line is that all kinds of audiences had other options the weekend Kraven started its box office run, and people largely opted to not give the movie a chance. Granted, a different set of competitors probably wouldn't have turned Kraven into a hit, but the movie might have performed just a little bit better. Critics weren't enamored with Kraven the Hunter, and that's not very surprising. For reference, Madam Web has an abysmal 11% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. In a similar vein, despite being the fan-favorite franchise of the Sony Spider-Man universe, the Venom movies have never been critical darlings either. Considering the surrounding context, Kraven might have actually performed better with critics than some might expect, but that still isn't particularly good. Metacritic gave Kraven a score of 35. While that's sure to keep the movie off many people's watch lists, it isn't catastrophic. The Rotten Tomatoes score, on the other hand, was a little more alarming. At just a 16% approval rating, Kraven might beat out Madam Web, but that's saying very little. It's worth mentioning that audiences seem to be taking it quite a bit easier on Kraven. 7 days into its theatrical run, the audience approval score sits at 73%. This puts Kraven firmly into Morbius territory. However, the filmmakers might not see that similarity as a good thing, since audiences mostly seem to love how bad Morbius is. But it does mean that Kraven could go on to find some kind of loyal fan base in the future. Kraven the Hunter may be a misguided effort released at an unfortunate time, but the movie still has some redeeming qualities. Many reviewers agreed that, despite a lackluster story, the movie's action scenes were top-notch and made even better by Aaron Taylor Johnson's performance. As YouTuber Zach Pope said in his review, "He's great as Kraven the Hunter, at least in terms of the action and embodying that." Shadows on the Wall also praised the movie's leading man, noting, "Taylor Johnson is always interesting on screen and has an engaging, magnetic presence here." The outlet also celebrated the performances of Russell Crowe, Ariana DeBose, and Fred Hechinger. Of course, solid acting can only carry a movie so far. Both of those reviews maligned the dialogue in the movie and noted that the actors were obviously held back by the lines they needed to deliver.
You're just another man.
Whoever is righteous.
Hunting for a trophy.
Other reviewers pointed out how the uneven pacing and sloppy editing marred the overall experience of the movie, and some boiled down their criticism of the film to the simple fact that it's a boring movie. While the iPaper's review also had good things to say about the performances in the film, particularly Taylor Johnson's, it concluded, "His presence and slightly meerkat-esque Russian accent is not enough to paper the cracks of the film's dwindling entertainment factor." In short, the few positive elements the movie had going for it were completely outmatched by everything dragging it down. Kraven the Hunter also faced some problems that had nothing to do with the movie itself or with the rest of Sony's Spider-Man universe. The truth is that even in the world of Marvel Comics, Kraven just isn't that big of a character. He's an iconic Spider-Man villain who's been fighting the webhead for decades, but he's never really moved outside that universe. He hasn't squared off against the Avengers quite like Ultron, and he's not an epic-level threat like Thanos or Galactus. In the world of the comics, Kraven is closer to Morbius or Madam Web than someone like Venom. The symbiote has had plenty of his own solo comic series and has even been portrayed as a hero at times. Venom has a cult following all his own, and that's a big part of why the Venom movies have found some success. Kraven, on the other hand, is really just a B-level character who only exists to play a supporting role in Spider-Man's story. You're always going to expect to see Kraven pop up in Spidey comics, but you'll almost never see him anywhere else. Because of that, it's a little surprising that Sony tried to make Kraven the star of his own movie in the first place. Kraven isn't the most famous Marvel villain by any stretch of the imagination, but die-hard Spider-Man fans still love the character. Because of his long history as one of Spider-Man's rogues, there are definitely some people who were intrigued to see what a live-action version of Kraven would actually be like. Most people probably found themselves a little lost by what they saw while watching Kraven the Hunter. There are some aspects of the character that are straight out of the comics, but in many ways, Sony's version of Kraven is an entirely different person. The movie completely rewrites his backstory, motivation, and power set from the comics. In the movie, Kraven loves his brother and hates his drug-trafficking father. He's an animal lover who, after a near-death experience, gets powers from a mysterious serum and ends up fighting against his father's criminal empire. In the comics, Kraven torments his brother, gets his powers by stealing a mystical potion from a witch doctor, and spends his life being wholly obsessed with hunting the most dangerous animals in existence. It's not surprising that the movie decided to tone down Kraven somewhat, but the comics version of the Hunter is at his best when he's at his most over-the-top. Sony's character just doesn't have the same appeal. Sony massively changed Kraven's backstory for the movie, but Kraven the Hunter might have had a shot if it had included the single most important aspect of Kraven's character from the comics. For fans of the Sam Raimi trilogy, his motivations might sound similar to another villain's.
I have nothing left except Spider-Man.
If there's one thing that any comic book fan can tell you about Kraven, it's that his main goal in life is to be the person who kills Spider-Man. Unlike many other Spider-Man villains, Kraven doesn't have a personal connection to or vendetta against the webhead. Kraven just thinks that Spider-Man's powers make him the ideal target for the greatest hunt of all time. Kraven the Hunter suffers from Spidey's absence more than any of the other Sony Spider-Man universe movies. Venom has Eddie Brock to rely on, and together the two of them have their own set of enemies. Morbius can get some mileage out of his struggle with his vampiric nature, and Madam Web at least did have a tenuous connection to Spider-Man himself. Kraven, however, feels completely disconnected from the broader universe, and the character doesn't function very well without his desire to kill Spider-Man. If all the other problems facing the movie had simply disappeared, Kraven would still have struggled to get past the fact that the movie doesn't make Spider-Man part of its story. It looks like Kraven the Hunter is going to bring the Sony Spider-Man universe to a close, but what does that actually mean? Sony might not make any more standalone movies about Spider-Man villains in the near future, but the company certainly isn't done with the wall crawler just yet. The animated Spiderverse franchise is still very much alive, but it could be a while before it comes back to theaters. After all, production on that franchise's third installment had to stop during the 2023 writer's strike, and rumors have put its release as far out as 2026 or 2027. Meanwhile, Sony is still keeping itself involved in the world of live-action Spider-Man movies. Sony and Marvel have confirmed that Tom Holland's fourth Spider-Man movie is in production, and it's currently scheduled to start filming in 2025. We've heard some Spider-Man 4 plot rumors that suggest the movie could take place directly after the events of 2026's Avengers Doomsday, which makes sense since Spider-Man 4 is set for release on July 24, 2026. Even if Sony doesn't completely give up on the idea of having its own Spider-Man universe, Kraven the Hunter is likely to be the end of the version of that universe we've already seen. The MCU is charging on ahead, and Spider-Man will have some role to play in what happens next. Sony's dysfunctional universe, on the other hand, is gonna have to go back to the drawing board.